But first, former presidents say the darndest things, don't they? Over the weekend, a news story came out in which Jimmy Carter had to say this about President Bush, and I quote, "I think as far as the adverse impact on the nation around the world, this administration has been the worst in history." Wow, maybe he doesn't think it sounds so harsh with his southern accent, but I think, as far as the adverse impact on the American nation, I would say that the Carter administration was the worst in history. But, what do I know? I'm not a peanut farmer or anything like that. Carter's statement didn't really leave a lot of room for misinterpretation, but he decided he needed to declare himself. Watch this as he tries to clarify himself this morning on NBC's Today Show.
Well, what I was actually doing was responding to a question comparing this administration's foreign policy with that of Richard Nixon. And I think Richard Nixon had a very good and productive foreign policy. And my remarks were maybe careless or misinterpreted, but I wasn't comparing the overall administration, and I was certainly not talking personally about any president.
Oh, well, that explains it. He left out his administration. He was only comparing him to Nixon. The only thing worse than a guy who'd kick a president when he's down is a guy like Jimmy Carter who doesn't remember what it's like to be the guy getting kicked. So let me remind him. Stephen Hayward is the author of The Real Jimmy Carter and fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Stephen, help me remind President Carter what things were like during his presidency. Let's start with the interest rate.
Right. Well, I think interest rates topped out at about 20% in 1979 and 1980. And
those were the days.
Inflation was 15%.
Jeez.
In fact, for a while, inflation and Carter's approval rate were running neck and neck that year.
Wait a minute. Hang on just a second. Didn't they invent a word for him? Wasn't stagflation invented for him?
Well, stagflation was invented in the 70s, and it got worse under him. What Carter should be remembered for, I think, among other things, was inventing the misery index in 1976 when he ran for office. Remember, that was the combination of inflation and unemployment together, and I think it was something like 15% when he ran for office in 1976, and it was about 28% or so in 1980. So the misery index almost doubled under his own measure.
I'm trying to remember because I was young enough to not really remember things clearly, except the misery of my parents who owned a small business. But am I correct in remembering the fact that he blamed inflation on the American people?
Well, he blamed a lot of things on the American people. At one point, he said that inflation was related to the moral failings of the American character. But look, that was all part of a piece with Carter. Remember that he ran for office on the slogan of giving us a government as good as the people. That was one of his leading slogans. And then at Low Ebb in 1979, he gave that famous speech where essentially he said the American people were no good. It wasn't his fault. It was our fault.
And foreign policy, because as I'm reading this in the newspaper, I look up at TV and the entire Middle East is on fire. And I'm thinking, I'm reading it, and they're like, and he was remembered for his peace process in the Middle East. And I'm like, didn't really work out so well. Isn't he really indeed responsible in many ways for what happened in Iran and what's still going on today?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long story, but essentially Carter was AWOL over the whole revolutionary period in Iran and pulled the plug on the Shah, whom he personally disliked. And what a catastrophe that has been. That was a major turning point in giving us the world we have today of out-of-control Islamic radicalism threatening to engulf the Western world, and that really was the major turning point for it, yes.
He is such an amazing guy that I don't know how or why anybody is embracing him. I swear it's like collective amnesia or something, but they're embracing him, the world is embracing him, and he hasn't done anything of real lasting good in the peace department, has he?
Well, no. Well, I mean, the Camp David Accords were his one genuine achievement. But look, there's two things about Carter that have made this work for him. One is he trades on his good works like Habitat for Humanity and working to eradicate...
I noticed that interview was with the building in the back.
He's in New Orleans banging nails today. And he's good at that. And if he stuck with that, I'd think he was a fine fellow, too. But he trades on that and the moral authority he gets from that to pontificate on American politics and foreign affairs.
Well, but it's not... It's really the foreign affairs thing. I mean, no president goes across overseas and says these kinds of things, and yet he's got a history. I mean, he called... Correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't he call Kim Jong-il someone like George Washington?
Yes, that's right. He says things like that all the time. Yeah, I mean, it's a very telling thing that Carter is most popular in the countries that hate America the most. That's all you really need to know about his attitude and the way he conducts himself overseas.
Well, I got to tell you, I mean, it makes sense. He's popular in those countries and in Michael Moore's house.
Well, that's right. Right.
Steve, thanks. Coming up, David Hasselhoff.